Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with the team from Counterweight, and I have with me Helen Pluckrose, Harriet Terrell, Izzy Marston, Kevin, and I'm sorry, Kevin, I don't know your last name, and Jennifer Friend. Hi everyone, thanks for coming on.
Hi, babes.
Thank you for having us.
So you guys are all on Counterweight, and I guess Helen, this was kind of your brainchild, or something that grew up organically around you, I should say. And you guys are coming up on 1 year. So if you want to maybe give a bit of the background of how this all came about and what you've been doing, and then we can just kind of take it from there.
Sure. I mean, the way that we started was really with lots of people emailing me, hundreds of people a day with in crisis with their workplace mostly, but perhaps their university or their child's school, suddenly implementing policies and training programs that were really critical social justice based to quite an extreme extent, which was requiring people to pretend to be racist or pretend to experience certain kinds of racism, to have certain ideas about gender ideology. And it was quite an authoritarian move, and people were emailing me to say, how can I push back at this? How can I argue against it? How can I decline to go to this meeting, talk to my employer, try to get this to stop? And I was trying to help people individually, and I was sending them some of the same information, and it was just unmanageable. So Kevin Lowe here, he built the Discord server, and I started to pour people into it. And Kevin built up the channels around it so that people could connect with each other. And then Carrie, who had her background in the Citizens Advice Bureau, started to build resource banks and advice pathways around what people needed. So that was how we started. And then we developed further, because as we realized the level of education and information that people needed, we needed the content team, which is Harriet and Izzy. We needed the peer support team, which is led by Jen. And we needed more sort of academic resources broken down into accessible information, which is essentially me. So that's the general story of us.
Okay. So I guess I'll start going down the row a little bit. And so Izzy and Harriet, if you don't mind speaking about the content and what you guys have been doing and what's been created, and then we can kind of just move down the road.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I was actually one of the panicked people that came to Helen when my employer implemented mandatory unconscious bias training. And and Helen was kind enough to put me in touch with the caseworking team, and Carrie was one of the people that helped me. And so my background is actually in copywriting and content creation. So after I had Counterweight support and was able to work through the issue of the mandatory unconscious bias training in my business and convinced them not make it mandatory for myself, I volunteered to join the Counterweight team and offered my content sort of creation services. And Izzy, who is my close friend, is a brilliant writer and a philosophy student, and I knew that she would be incredibly useful in the organization as well, so I employed her help. And we started by creating sort of accessible videos. So the goal was, we know that CSJ theory is just full of jargon, it's really inaccessible, and we wanted to help people to understand all of these kind of crazy terms that they were coming across in their businesses as these new training courses were introduced. So we wanted to create videos that broke down all of the complexity of CSJ in a way that was understandable, and a way that people could use to push back in their organizations. So that's how we began. And then, as you all know, Obeyed, the content team started to expand, and we've now got a whole team of really brilliant people who help us out. We've got writers, researchers, we've got podcasters, we've got videographers, designers, and they're all people from across the political spectrum. So as you know as well, we're a non-partisan group and we celebrate all different viewpoints. So we're really grateful to have all these different people bringing their expertise to the team. yeah, so that's what I would say.
Right. And Izzy, what do you have to? So, like, I know, like, because we do a little bit of stuff. Like, I found you guys some stuff, some background info. So, like, Harriet had mentioned, like, you're doing some writing. So, like, what kind of stuff have you been writing on? Or are you doing more editing? Or
Yeah, so I'm the editor, which originally like kind of happened by default, right? It was just Harriet and I at the beginning, and I was writing the script with Harriet, we were doing it together, the videos, and then people kind of our content team grew. People started giving articles in, so I started editing all of them. I haven't written that much other than the script. I think I wrote like one piece for Counterweight, but hopefully I'm gonna try and do more of that now that uni's finished and I have more time. I'm gonna try and write more. But yeah, mainly I'm the editor. That's mainly what I do. But so we're launching like an educational platform. That's what we hope to do. It's like in the super early stages at the moment. But I'm working with James, who's like he's a lawyer, yeah. James on it. We're doing a critical thinking course. This is the very first thing that we're trying to do because we didn't want to be like just anti-woke, right? Even though like inevitably that's a lot of what we do because we're an organization that helps people push back against critical social justice. So to a certain extent, like we can't help but be doing that. But we wanted to also help people understand liberal values and understand critical thinking so they don't have to take what we say at face value, right? So that's what the critical thinking course is. We might go through how to spot fallacies, how to reason for yourself, how to understand whether arguments are valid or sound, all that kind of stuff, how to test your own beliefs, right? Because we have a tendency to, confirmation bias, right? We have a tendency to just not question our own beliefs in the same ways that we do to other people. And that's certainly true even for people that are against identity politics, that are on the left. They still need to criticize their own views and think about them a little bit more. So hopefully we just want to help people do that generally, right? Yeah, that's the next thing that we're going to do, I think. Yeah.
great, thanks. And Kevin. So Helen mentioned you started up the Discord server. So I guess at the start you had your hands full trying to make sure Helen doesn't forget her password.
Yeah, yeah. I built the Discord, and then I'm still in charge of moderating that. We're trying to make sure it remains welcoming and tolerant to any different viewpoints who come onto it. And our main focus with the Discord is just making sure that it remains tolerant and doesn't become too biased and too set in one direction. Soon after the Discord, I also built our website, and I'm in charge of maintaining and updating that. I also oversee many of our projects to ensure that we keep a liberal humanist equilibrium that encourages the free exchange of ideas. I keep up to date with development stateside, so Helen can focus more on the UK, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. I've helped write some ethical policies for our employers who have contacted us. I also just do a lot of the boring stuff behind the scenes that keeps the systems running and stuff. Pretty
Okay.
basic.
That I know a lot about. I spent plenty of time in IT.
And he does indeed spend a lot of time rescuing me from technological disasters that shouldn't really happen to a competent adult in the 21st century.
Well,
Yeah, I do a lot of tech support for anybody who needs it within the organization and outside of it often as well.
I got a question for you about the Discord server because Helen mentioned you created the communities and things. So, are you like? I mean, initially you'll go in and you'll create some basic communities, but then did you start creating stuff as you saw a need, or were people asking for stuff? Let's say there was a group of 20 people from New York City, and they said, "Look, can we get a subgroup just for New York City to create these topics?" Or like, again, how did that grow?
Well, I started off with a set of basic channels to try to cover the needs that I kind of foresaw, but people in the Discord did request many channels. That's pretty common in Discords, but you don't want to add too many because then you end up with a channel for every little thing that could possibly come up, and you end up with not very much discussion. So it's good to kind of keep it, to not let it extend too far. But I think we have like maybe 30 or 40 channels now, maybe more than that. But yeah, I just kind of I try to go back and make revisions as we see a need for them.
On that, because I've been in a few groups, especially online, and like Discord's a little different, but like, let's say like Facebook groups, and they start off all nice and good, and then they just devolve. And I mean, how, like, if you've got like 30 channels, I mean, how do you moderate that to make sure they stay on topic? Like, I mean, and again, it's kind of weird to say, okay, you want to push liberal values, but then you want to keep everyone on topic. That's, it just kind of seems like indicative to.
Yeah, I don't really care too much about them staying on content as far as staying on topic as far as the topic of the channel. I'm more worried about people being uncivil and unfair to people. The main concern is civility. I don't want people fighting on this server. I don't want people hostile with each other. I don't really. We're pretty lax as far as staying on topic and stuff like that goes. But it is a challenge. It's easy for a Discord server to kind of devolve into something that we definitely wouldn't want, and that hasn't really been a challenge for us. The people in the Discord stay pretty civil. It's actually been amazing how civil the Discord has remained over the year or so that it's been up. It surprises me a lot, and I keep expecting things to get worse and harder to maintain, but it's been really great so far.
All right, great, thanks. Jennifer,
I'm amazed at, I'm amazed at how civil people have been. Kevin has done a lot of preparing for in case people broke into warring tribal camps and what we'd do to try and mediate and stop that, and they generally haven't done it.
That's good.
Sorry.
No
carry
problem. On. And finally, Jennifer, Helen had mentioned that you were doing peer support, and we'd spoken a little while ago, and you were talking about basically like counseling and therapy. So if you want to maybe talk a bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I came to Counterweight initially as a client myself, and quite a panic about what my employer was doing. A particularly virulent form of CRT happened at my workplace, and I reached out to Helen and received support through Counterweight. And as more and more people were reaching out to Counterweight asking for help and advice on what to do when critical social justice overwhelmed their workplace or school, Counterweight started noticing that people were experiencing some pretty intense emotional distress. And so I started providing one-on-one listening sessions to people in the form of peer support, using what I've experienced in my workplace, as well as my mental health background. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And so the one-on-one sessions afford people an opportunity to share their thoughts and their feelings without any fear of repercussions, without fear of being judged or being deemed racist. And I have been incredibly lucky to be able to pull together a group of very dedicated volunteers from the US and Canada and the UK to provide individual listening sessions because we have such a high demand, and to also provide listening groups. So listening groups are awesome. We have 5 of them running. When we posted that we were doing listening groups, we received about 100 signups. And it's an opportunity for people in the Counterweight community to get together and get to know each other and share their experiences in their school place or work, and to give and receive support and form community. So it's been amazing. I have been meeting, honestly, the coolest people I've ever met in my life. The people who reach out to Counterweight they tend to be independent thinkers. They tend to be very conscientious, ethical people who are very concerned with the approach that's being taken to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And they're just lovely people. And even though I'm very concerned about the culture wars, the Counterweight clients have really restored my faith in humanity. They're just lovely, and it's a wonderful experience.
Great, thanks. Okay, on this, because, and I think I asked you this last time we spoke, but Helen, like you do more of the work. I know you do the academic stuff, but the counterweight also helps people push back, like from it encroaching into the workplace. But how does that go hand in hand with what Jennifer does?
Well, quite often when people come to us and they're having a problem and they want to speak to their employer, they want to write to their employer to have a meeting, they're so anxious, they're so their heads are so full that getting out, I'm asking them, if you give me a list of the issues that you're having problems with and a list of your objections, I can help you to, to frame that into the most sort of knowledgeable and principled letter that we can do that will be effective and will minimize the risk to you. But if they are in a really intense state of anxiety, actually sort of ordering their thoughts is a problem. So I have had to refer people to Jen and her team before that. They've sort of helped them to think through, to gain some perspective, to just generally feel heard and think. If you're not allowed to speak, it becomes very difficult to think, and people often just have this horrible sense that something is wrong and it's really unethical and it's really oppressive, but actually articulating their liberal objection to it is quite difficult. So sorting out those intuitions, those feelings, those fears first, then enables them to come back to me or to Kevin, and for us to help them to write down, first of all, precisely what the problem is, precisely what they want to argue about it. We can also practice with them by Zoom. Often I advise people to avoid meetings if they can and keep things in writing as much as possible, because of the tendency to waffle on the part of employers who don't really know what they're signing up for. So trying to get things in writing is a good way to go about it. But this all kind of works together. So we have the content team who are producing not only sort of accessible guides to how the problem works, but common mistakes that people can make when they're addressing them, most effective ways to go about addressing them, how to understand and speak about the problem. Then I've been writing some walkthroughs. How do you assess the problem? Are you actually having a CSJ problem? What kind of problem is it? What level is it? What proportionate response do you need? And with all these resources together, and Jen sort of helping them to keep their keep themselves sort of calm and steady, then it all kind of works together to make people feel supported on a number of levels.
Okay. No, because one other thing, because I mean, I've just been following this because I've had nothing else to do but sit online. Which I guess there's a lot of other things I could be doing, but anyways, but one of the things, it's like it's being opposed at work, and I mean, some of the things I've read recently, it was students who were saying, well, I don't agree with this, but I can't speak out because I'm gonna be called a racist, or I'm gonna be called a sexist or a homophobe or whatever, the whole litany of things, right? And that reminded me a lot of living a double life. And I compared it to religion. I mean, it was for about 6 years I was an apostate, but I didn't tell anyone. So like it reminded me a lot of that. And I mean, are you seeing stuff like that, or are those rare cases?
Yeah. We're seeing quite a lot of things that are very much like that. In fact, we've had a case which is exactly like that. We've had a secular liberal humanist from a conservative Muslim background move to a Western country and say to his employer, yes, I shall now be able to actually be a liberal humanist, and I can be for gender equality and LGBT equality and generally liberal universalism, and it's great to be in a country that actually supports that, and then say, no, that's not the equity, diversity and inclusion that we want from you. That's you're being Islamophobic, and you need to start taking on these ideas. So I'm dramatizing a little, but he really was quite bewildered because he'd been trying to be a liberal humanist and he hadn't really been able to in his religious community, and then he was trying to be a liberal humanist in a strongly critical social justice environment, and he wasn't allowed to speak there either. So it's very, very similar, and I think that is where there's a culture of fear, where there's a culture where people are really finding it difficult to speak that without landing themselves in trouble, either sort of by mistake or by actually just getting fed up and speaking their mind. This is where we have the problem, and this is what we're trying to address, and we're trying to make it easier for people, because we are apostates. There is strong parallels with the idea of heresy, a blasphemy and apostasy. I think the best way to describe a lot of the diversity training is uniformity training, and it does match up very similarly to what I studied in the late medieval period, the catechism that religious believers, that Christians, Catholics would be taught to go through. They'd be asked a series of questions, they'd have to give the right answers, then they would have to recite the right creed, and they'd need to do this at regular intervals. And if they didn't, then they would have to, explain themselves. They would have to repent. They would have to do various things to restore the equilibrium. And I think this is human nature, and I think we're seeing it again, and we need to recognize it.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, I wanted to ask you something, because you said you kind of keep an eye on the US while Helen pays more attention to the UK. When I compare Canada to the US, like in the education system, let's just say, it's more from a post-colonial lens. Even to some degree in some of the diversity trainings with the employers and stuff like that, you'll have a lot of employers who will, before large events, they'll make a land acknowledgement statement. And I mean, now recently I've seen something called a body acknowledgement statement, but that was really bizarre. So what are the differences you notice between the US and the UK when this stuff comes about?
I think the main difference between the US and the UK is that the US is an at-will, or I think almost all states are at-will states in the US. So an employer can basically let you go for no reason. So we've found that it's a lot harder to fight all of this in the US than it is in the UK and outside of the US in general, because I mean, even if an employee wins, say, and gets whatever their goal is in the US, they can be fired right after that for no reason. So it's a lot more difficult. I think employees are a lot more afraid of being fired in the US than they are outside of the US. Mm. Our job is definitely harder in the US than it is outside the US, and I'm more worried about the US than outside of the US as far as CSJ goes. Canada might be an exception, but generally the way employers are set up in the US makes our job a good amount harder.
The pushback to it, like, in a play like what you said, like you feel a little bit more optimistic about the UK as opposed to the US, I would kind of agree with you there, just because of the sprawl of how many institutions I've lately been seeing in the US that are going along this path. And, like the ACLU, as far as I'm concerned, is lost. SPLC, same thing. I don't want to, seeing some of the things coming out of the military recently, like it's not a good thing. Whereas, and then if you have the academy, like if this is, coming out of the academy and all that. So do you see, like, like you said, the employee might win a case, or it might win a small battle, but end up being fired for something else. But that's because the culture of the company that he's working at is gone, in the CSJ route. Like, the pushback effect, like it's got to be a lot more holistic. Like, you have to take a look at the academy. You have to take a look at some of these institutions. You have to take a look. I mean, it's good to help people push back at their work or at their school, but if you don't take care of the stuff in the background, like, how do you see that going?
On a wider political level, if we're looking at changing institutions, changing laws, that's something that is largely beyond our scope. Our aim really is to create a groundswell, whereas a lot of other organizations are sort of working top down, and so they're taking something big like education or universities or policing or something like this, and they're aiming campaigns at it. Now we do that to an extent as well, if we're aware of legislation, as Jen recently with David Bernstein did an initiative in Maryland where healthcare workers were being expected to undergo unconscious bias training before they could have their licenses renewed. We can get involved in these campaigns. We got involved with one about problems in humanitarian aid. So we can address these big institutions to a certain extent, but the counterweight method is much more of a bottom-up approach. So we will take the individual and we will take an organization, and that one individual in that one organization, if we can have a victory there, and then we can have another victory, and then another victory, and then we're kind of doing a patchwork thing where we can join people together. We can create a community on the Discord server. We can collect people in the same areas of expertise, in the same regions, and we can build these small victories into a larger growth while producing a greater degree of knowledge and understanding via the content production, via the Discord, the conversations that we're having, the new education platform that we're producing, to produce a lot of people who are on the ground dealing with this. They are average people. They're not, big influencers. They're just people in their lives pushing back at it as it arises, because they understand how it works, because they have backup, because they have support. And we think these kind of approaches can work cooperatively as we sort of push upwards with our sort of grassroots groundswell approach. Those organizations that are operating from a top down, we will meet in the middle and we can refer people back and forth to each other. So I think it's quite an effective way of approaching the problem from different angles, and it also makes a difference to an individual's life. And I think a lot of us, as Jen says, and as I say, we find that particularly satisfying. We get to know people on an individual level. We know what their problem is, and when we've succeeded in helping them have their problem resolved, then there's a celebration. And as Kevin says, yes, there is a big difference. I mean, Harriet essentially won her case by being a very polite and persistent pain in the ass for about 8 months. And we can't really encourage Americans to make a nuisance of themselves, even very politely, without great caution, because of what Kevin describes, there's sort of no cause firing policies. There's only so much you can make a nuisance of yourself, even if you're really polite. So it's very much a matter of taking in the individual situation, the consequences that are likely if they make a complaint, if they try and address the issue, and then trying to tailor a solution to their needs, which could range anything from actually addressing the problem, helping them to find an organization that will provide legal advice, just completely solving the issue, to giving them backup and support and letting them know that they're not alone.
Okay, thanks. Jen, last time we'd spoken, you'd mentioned that there was, I think you'd said Virginia, where a few people from Counterweight kind of started up like a meetup group or something like that.
Oh, that was Maryland.
Maryland. Okay. Now, are you hoping for more things like that to happen? And I mean, I'm not saying forcing it, but just kind of more seeing like that to happen organically, so people do have that local support. So whereas, let's say you're going to your school's PTA meeting or something, and you want some backup with you or something like that.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen. I would love to see more coalitions form, particularly in terms of protecting various institutions and professions. The medical and mental health profession are really under assault right now from critical social justice. And in Maryland, for example, the bill unfortunately did pass, which requires all health professionals with licensure. So that means doctors, nurses, clinical social workers, occupational therapists, that all of them have to undergo annual unconscious bias training in order to maintain licensure. And in my opinion, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's more in store for people maintaining professional licenses. That critical social justice is going to intrude further upon that. And so I think that forming coalitions to push back against that in a constructive, principled way is going to become very essential.
Okay, thanks. Kind of on that. So, Harriet, Nissy, like, would you ever at any point start thinking of creating stuff to help people? Like, okay, if you want to get organized, if you want to, get people at your office or people, parents at your school or people in your neighborhood, get them together. Like, would you ever consider creating, like, maybe just a little guidebook or just something like that?
Yeah, definitely. So we've already created videos that direct people to organizations that will help them to connect with other people. So, for example, we just did one on the increasing implementation of CSJ ideology in schools and how parents can protect their children. And in that, we talked about how people could organize and connect with other parents. There's a few other organizations who are doing that fantastically. I know FAIR have got a great system in place, and Parents Defending Education as well. But so we already do direct people to the right places so that they can do that. But we are also creating the Counterweight handbook over the next sort of few months. And in that, we're going to give people more information about how they can connect with other people in communities, how they can actually push back against their individual employers and make a real change within their individual businesses and universities, and how to do so in a way that's principled and is still coming from a balanced place. I think it's so easy to sway too far in the other direction with this stuff. So it's kind of one of the other things that we want to help people to do is not get dragged off into a space they don't want to be in.
Yeah, that's part of the sort of what we're calling the academic project, but it's essentially breaking things down to how it's impacting real life. So we have 4 books planned, but the handbook is the one that is coming soonest, and that's been accepted. There are already people wanting to translate it, and we haven't finished with where it's in note form at the moment. So that's going to have it's like a triage kit. It'll explain to people what is critical social justice, how to tell what level of problem you're having, how to push back at it proportionately. So Izzy and Harriet will be contributing those chapters on how to approach things in a persistent, polite, consistent way, how to avoid common mistakes, how to not fall into a sort of counter authoritarianism in your activism against these kinds of things. In the next section, we're going to have useful sort of resources for sample letters and to understand different ways in which you can resist, because people tend to think that if you're going to resist this, you either throw yourself on the grenade, and then sort of risk getting fired and not being able to feed and house your family, or you shut up. But no, there are levels and there are ways. So we're going to look at 3 different approaches you can take addressing a problem. Kevin is going to contribute a chapter on how to write policies in order for employers that can protect their employees against ideological conformity and allow freedom of belief and speech while still consistently opposing racist discrimination. Jen is going to contribute a chapter of just how to survive this psychologically, and the kinds of problems that people are experiencing, and how you can deal with it and come through it by finding community, by talking to people. And she certainly knows a lot more about what she's going to put in that chapter than I do, but I think that'll be an important one. And we'll have a couple of academic-ish longer chapters at the end where I will break down the theories, the key theories, how they work. And we'll also adapt a mammoth document written by Carrie on all the studies into unconscious bias training and the implicit association test, and why it's not replicating, why it doesn't work, how it can be counterproductive. So people who want to have a deeper dive and can actually get a grasp will have those more detailed chapters, but people who are just immediately facing a problem will have much simpler, shorter chapters that answer the question, shit, I'm in trouble, what do I do now? And we'll have sample letters and useful organization. So it would be a very practical kind of book. That's our first project. We have other plans to produce a book on how to address hot topic issues with liberal reasoning. That will largely involve Kevin and me looking at how to be consistently liberal, essentially, when you're dealing with something like gender ideology, or if you're dealing with different ways of addressing racism. We also want to look at what is happening, what people are actually experiencing within mental health and within therapy. So what are their experiences on the ground? And we want to look at what's happening with artists. We're hearing repeatedly from artists of all kinds about the ways in which they are being constrained, what this is doing to art and culture generally, and what they want to do about it. So I think these are all quite exciting but accessible books that people will want to read. And and I shall also hopefully be contributing a bit to the educational channel for those people who are masochistic and want to understand things in a bit more detail about various critical theories.
We're kind of on this. So you're seeing a lot of there's legislation coming out in a lot of states, and some people are opposing it as anti-CRT. And then there's videos of parents going up as well. And then you have the, keeping it kind of with a religious theme, the apologists for CRT or the apologists for CSJ saying, no, that's not CRT. What are you talking about? When I speak to people about this, I just kind of equate it to them. I say, you know what? In the same way that intelligent design was smuggling Christianity into the curriculum, what's going on with the diversity and what's going on, no, that's not CRT a la Delgado or anything like that, but that is, smuggling CRT into the curriculum under another guise. I kind of equate it to that. Do you see that helping you, or do you see that making things getting worse for you? Like all those legislations and things like that coming out?
They're just so vague. That's the problem. If people, if school districts have a responsibility to teach children in a balanced way and not indoctrinate them in any one ideology, this is certainly a good thing. But when we've got this really kind of vague legislation that can be used, I mean, we see this in the UK. In the UK, there's a requirement for schools to have 15 minutes of collective worship of a broadly Christian nature. Now, that's something the British Humanist Association and I have been trying to get out of schools for a long time. But the schools have a great deal of power in how they implement that. So a lot of them will just do some nice stuff about, loving your brother and being kind to people, and they'll call this broadly Christian. And there won't be anything, it'll be secular, it'll be humanist. Whereas other schools, if they have a teacher who is a very committed Christian, as unfortunately my daughter's school did, then you get kids being told about how they're going to go to hell if they don't believe the right things, and bringing home lovely pictures of lakes of blood, which apparently was an excellent way to celebrate Passover. So yeah, that's what worries me with the US legislation is that there is such a vagueness there that I think it leaves schools. I mean, what does it mean by you cannot promote these ideas? Does this mean you cannot say these ideas, or does it mean you can't say that they're true? So but I should probably will let one of the Yanks speak to this in a bit more depth.
Yeah, I have something to say about that. So it's a really thorny issue in the US because in the schools, K through 12, CRT isn't being presented as a theory. Well, here's one way of viewing our nation and our problems and our history. It's being presented as fact, and it's not being presented in a sort of standalone, sectioned off way, so that oh, this is the time where we're teaching critical race theory. It's being actually woven through the curriculum and so deeply embedded in the curriculum that it becomes quite difficult to tease out. So I don't know that bills banning it will be effective anyhow, because of how it's being woven through. For example, sometimes in English class, the content will be CRT based. They'll use it to teach just concepts in English, like how to identify a subject of a sentence, but it'll be CRT information. So I think it's really challenging to address it when it's woven through in that way. And then there's also attempts being made in the United States to disguise CRT. They're calling it by different names in the schools. And then they're saying, oh, we're not doing CRT. So if there's a bill saying you can't do CRT, setting aside the concerns about banning things and the infringement on free speech, there's some very committed activists who then just shapeshift and call it something else and package it differently while it is indeed the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, when I brought up the intelligent design, that's kind of what I was getting at, because intelligent design, they packaged it so it didn't mention God. It mentioned a designer. It kind of strayed away from like Christian language per se, but it was evangelical Christians pushing it through, right? So it's the same thing I see with this. So when people come back and say, well, that's not CRT, it's like, okay, we can get really technical about it. And I think, Helen, that's where your academic stuff would come in. It's like, okay, no, Robin DiAngelo is technically whiteness studies. It's not critical race theory, but they're the same thing. But that's what I was talking about. Like it's being smuggled in other ways. So
there's a Motte and Bailey thing going on where Sometimes people will claim that any criticism, that all critical race theory is a historically literate look at racism in the US. And that isn't what it is. So I'm going to make a short video in the next few days in which I'm going to cite a lot of the main tenets of critical race theory, which is the branch that really existed from 1970 to about 2000. And then what we're looking at the moment is better known as critical social justice approaches to anti-racism, which isn't very catchy. So that's not what people are using. I think there's a problem with people objecting to the term CRT. Because it's a catch-all. I think if we were going to be completely accurate, we should call them critical theories of race, and then that would cover the whole lot. And we could be very clear that this isn't nobody, well, some people will be, but no liberal, reasonable person is going to be criticizing a historical approach at American history, which includes slavery and Jim Crow, and pointing out that those things were extremely racially oppressive. That isn't generally what parents are complaining about. And we've just seen in the UK, the Telegraph has just published something about some plan to start teaching elementary school children that they have white privilege, if they're white, obviously, and introducing these ideas. And these really aren't, they're not kind of sneaked in the same way that intelligent design is, because that really is the language. They're just saying, when we're talking about white privilege and whiteness and white fragility and how everybody's racist and how everybody else is oppressed, we're just talking about racism, and you just don't want us to talk about racism. So that's it's really much more overt, which does mean you can get at it more easily. But if we're having this confusion about what the language is and what it is that you're actually trying to ban, then it gets extremely messy. Certainly, yes, if you want to say we don't indoctrinate children into Marxist, conservative, libertarian, critical social justice, Christianity, Islam, or any ideology, that's a good all-round policy that I think schools should adopt. But what we're seeing at the moment with the conversation around CRT is people just aren't even able to discuss it properly, because nobody will agree on definitions and nobody will agree who understands what they're talking about.
Okay, this actually, Harry, you might be able to get onto this, because this is something I've said. When you speak, or if you listen to a scientist talk, watch a video from Carl Sagan or Richard Dawkins talking about biology, if they go back to jargon, then they'll do their best to explain it in plain English, because they want it broadly understood by the people they're speaking to. Whereas if you listen to, and there's a couple of people that have been doing it recently, like debates about CRT, and it's from people who say they're proponents of it, whatever. All they have is jargon. They can never really stop to explain it in plain language. I mean, the closest I've seen, and that was in a video from Kendi, it's like, a racist system is a system that, delivers racist results or something like that. And I was just like, okay, that's a nonsense answer. So, like, what do you get pushback on stuff, and like people are like, okay, you're not explaining this properly, and then they just give you a jargon-laden explanation for why you're wrong? Or like, how do you get around explaining some of this jargon to people? Because some of it is, when you try to break it down to plain and simple terms, it sounds a little crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. We don't actually get that much. I haven't really noticed people pushing back on us in that way. We don't tend to get like a lot of people that are maybe really into critical theory or proper advocates of it on the academic side, like coming at us or saying anything. I haven't noticed it very much in terms of our content. And also, a lot of our content isn't specifically about the academic side. So some of it is like we kind of have like varying degrees of difficulty, varying degrees of like, you know, the degree to which it's academic or it's just simple. But because a lot of what we're doing is targeted at the average person, in a way, it doesn't matter whether or not we're talking about critical race theory. The point is, what's the content, right? So whatever theory it is that the business or institution says they're implementing, that's not the issue. It's what's the content of it? Is it racist? Are they invoking stereotypes about people because of their race or whatever it is? If that's what they're doing, most people agree like that's wrong. Because a lot of the problem is people assume because it's social justice or because it's termed social justice, it's something they all want to get behind. As soon as you kind of say to people, oh, look, this is what this looks like, whereas this is what like most people would want to get behind, which is maybe the Martin Luther King idea of judge people by the, you know, the content of their character, not the color of their skin. People get behind it and it doesn't really matter whether or not we've exactly described critical race theory correctly or not, because it's not the point of issue, right? It's not the thing people are having issues with in the UK, especially in their businesses and stuff like that.
Okay. Kev, like, how about from yourself? Like, because you mentioned the employment and stuff. So when you're seeing some of the pushback, like, I know you're saying the Discord server and everything's okay, but are people posting, this is what I'm getting as pushback, or like, you know, like I've seen in other groups where, you know, whatever topic of the group is, they'll say, well, I posted this somewhere else, and then this is the response I got. Like, are you getting things like that where people are, you know, I had this problem show up at work where they're introducing this diversity training, and this is how I pushed back, and this was the responses I got. Like, are you seeing stuff like that?
A little bit. I think that a lot of people right now are don't really understand why some of the indoctrination that's coming out of critical race theory and critical theory are bad. They don't really get the problem with it. They just think that it's basically civil rights era anti-racism and that everybody should be behind it. I see a lot of that. I think most people, especially just normal people who aren't like Twitter activists or whatever, don't really understand what it is that they're advocating when they're pushing the CSJ stuff on employees or just in general.
You'd mentioned the arts, and because I've spoken to a few actors and a couple of musicians, but I don't know if you read this, and I saw it this morning, and I'm gonna mispronounce her name. Is Chimamanda Ngozi or something like that? You know, I mean, I'll just read like the last chapter. Like, she did it in three. She said it's like obscenity in three parts, and it's what she says here. It's just, I think to me, it's perfect. It's like, in certain young people today, like these two from my writing workshop, I notice what I find increasingly troubling: a cold-blooded grasping, a hunger to take and take and take, but never give, a massive sense of entitlement, and an inability to show gratitude, and an ease with dishonesty and pretension and selfishness. I mean, she goes on, but it was basically about how if she spoke out against, she said, I think at one point she said a trans woman is a trans woman, and she got grief for that. I mean, I know you're no stranger to that, Helen, but she got grief for that. And at the same time, the same people who were giving her grief were also giving her grief for not praising their work. You know, at one side of their mouth, they're saying you're a horrible human being, blah, 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 blah. And next they're saying, well, why aren't you praising my work? And she was talking about stuff like that. And again, she was talking about the arts. And it's, you know, I've read a couple articles now where authors are going back and changing their works because they're worried about what was in their work. Like, I was joking about this a while ago. I said, you know, buy all your stuff in hardback, because if they want, they're going to change your Kindle versions. And now I'm like, okay, it could happen.
Yeah, I mean, this is, until very recently, they were, the critical social justice activists were promoting Adichie's work, We Should All Be Feminists. Mm-hmm. And then when she revealed that her feminism is gender critical, she suddenly fell out of favor. And this is what happens. And this is something I think we're going to see an increasing conflict over, because the two big things at the moment are critical race theory and trans ideology. There's an attempt, particularly in the US, to try and do these two things together. And that doesn't actually work very well, because a lot of African Americans are more likely to be religious of Christian or Muslim faith, which means they're less likely to accept queer theory ideas of gender and sexuality. And trying to push these things together, it was a few years ago when I did some research into this, showing that I think African Americans were twice as likely to vote against same-sex marriage as white Americans were. So there's a conflict there where if you're trying to make everybody be intersectional, and it's a problem that liberals, we don't have to face this. If somebody is a marginalized group by their race, but they're also being homophobic, we don't have a conflict. We can just say nobody should be racist against you, and you shouldn't actually be homophobic against this person either. And these two things can exist at the same time because they're both illiberal. But if we're going with the race and the queer theory, and we're trying to combine them into intersectionality, what we end up with is a mess.
Yeah, there's a case recently in Canada that touches on this, and it was a Muslim family, and they were opposed to their child getting puberty blockers, because basically in a couple of provinces, if it's not affirmation therapy, and if the parents don't affirm it as well, the state can step in. And so they were actually in court about this. So now, and this happened before the recent attack in London, Ontario, where the guy ran over 4 people. But now that's going to cause some aneurysms in the social justice world, because it's okay. Do we protect the minority rights, or is it trans rights, or like what's going on there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the activists who tried to make a lot of lawsuits against people of minority religion, particularly Muslims, who didn't want to wax her scrotum because of beliefs, against this caused a problem. Now, that particular individual, whose name I can't bring to mind at the moment, wasn't a typical critical social. That's the one. Yeah. Now, that she wasn't a typical critical social justice activist. She was quite openly hostile to racial and religious minorities, and also perhaps not very mentally well. But that does present a genuine problem for a lot of people. If you've got people with socially conservative beliefs who have got those from a minority religion, and these are coming up against very, I want to say liberal, but I don't mean liberal in that sort of equal sense. I mean in that sort of liberation, sexual liberation sense. They're not going to agree with that. They're not going to agree with liberal LGBT activism, and they're not going to agree with CSJ LGBT activism. And so we have this conflict.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to kind of stick with this too much, but so going forward, because like I mentioned, you guys have done a year so far. So going forward, what are you hoping for? I know you've mentioned some of the books and things like that, but what are you like personally hoping for Counterweight? Because I mean, technically, it would almost be that you make yourself redundant, because if you help push back and if you help make people self-sufficient enough, then there won't really be a need for you. But like, where do you kind of see yourself going with this?
Okay, I'll answer first, and then I'll leave it to everybody else, because I would say yes, we really want to make ourselves redundant on the critical social justice front, but we're essentially a liberal humanist organisation. So the fact is that humans really aren't that liberal humanist. So there is always going to be some form of illiberalism to fight, and I think we'll always be fighting it.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the content team side, so as we talked earlier about the educational platform that we want to develop, it isn't strictly focused on CSJ ideology. It's helping people to restore liberal values to their organizations or within themselves. I think that's the wider goal. Yeah. And as I say, because we produce a variety of different types of content, it doesn't have to be restricted to CSJ ideology. So long as we're helping to instill liberalism, within people's minds, hearts, and organizations, I'm happy.
No, but with the curriculum or like the school content, I don't want to call it curriculum, but that's one of the issues, especially in the States. I mean, even here in Canada, I don't know about the UK, but there is no alternative being offered. Like, I mean, this stuff is pretty much what's coming out, and that's what's being offered in curriculums. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely ubiquitous, but you're seeing more and more of it. So if you actually have something else to offer to someone, instead of just saying, don't do this, but you're not giving them anything else, it's like, is that also kind of what you're hoping for, or what are you trying to do with that?
Do you mean are we hoping to create an entire curriculum?
I don't know if you want to say an entire curriculum, but at least like maybe like even a framework. So if someone wants to try to do something on their own, or someone's like, because I mean, I know in the US, like homeschooling is going bigger, especially like after the school was shut down for almost a year last year, like with the pandemic and everything. So people are looking at more like homeschooling and stuff like that. So like not even necessarily a curriculum, but like a framework for a curriculum or something, saying this is how you can build something for yourself or something like that. Or
it's certainly like an ambitious long-term goal that we'd like to aim at, for sure. I think we're starting with fundamentally like liberal courses that that are applicable to a broad range of people, mostly adults at an initial level, but we also do recognize the need for more materials for young children, especially those who are being homeschooled. And that's certainly something that we want to branch out into.
Yeah, I mean, so what we've got already is Wink and Den, right, have already kind of written two, which are essentially actually curriculums. One of them, it goes through curriculums that already exist, or reading guides that already exist, and it provides alternatives. One of them is really comprehensive. One of the things, I mean, they've already done this, right, so it's not in the future, but one of them is extremely comprehensive. It gives so many readings and questions, discussion questions, everything like that. But in terms of the educational platform, because of our resources, right, like we're not making really, really long courses. They're going to be at the moment like 4 hours, something like that. And at the moment they're for adults, so we do want to do things for universities and for children, but they would probably be quite restricted in their focus. So in terms of like, if people were looking for whole other syllabuses, like long term, if we could do that, that would be great. Yeah, that would be great. But it would require quite a lot of like thought, into everything they need to know if they need a whole new syllabus.
So the reason that we've taken this approach as well is ultimately we want to produce educational resources that are actually worthwhile and have had a deep amount of thought and energy and research put into them. So we're restricting our focus so that we can produce a small amount of courses that are really going to help people.
And they've generalized, right? So like we're doing restricted content, like short courses, but we're doing them on things that will generalize. So let's say you at your school, you have a syllabus, which is pretty terrible, and it's presenting you with things that are definitely not facts, and it's presenting them to you as facts. So we're doing stuff on critical thinking, we're doing stuff on viewpoint diversity. So that will generalize. So even though they're small courses, if people were to do them, they can go and have the actual syllabus that they're being taught, and then they can know how to test whether or not there's sufficient evidence for the claims that their teachers are giving them. They can know how to read text. So we might do ones on scientific thinking, so they can know whether if they're being presented with one study, whether or not it means anything, or if it's been replicated, or if the sample size was correct, all of that kind of stuff. So if we do restricted stuff, we can generalize. I think that's the hope. We want to do the really, really important stuff that will help people when they're learning other syllabuses that might not be that might be a bit dodgy.
Okay. Cool.
So teaching people how to think about the whatever it is they're getting, which can be applied more broadly. And I think that's something that's very much needed. Obviously, my focus is more specific. So we have an incredibly long essay entitled How to Be Not Racist, in which we essentially take issue with Ibram X. Kendi and argue for it being perfectly possible for a person to reject racist ideas, and in fact they should do so. And if they have difficulty doing so, there are measures in which can help them do so. And of course, that we've also got the young adult version of Cynical Theories is going to be coming out in the autumn, which we hope to interest schools in as a kind of counter view. And it's done its best to be charitable to critical social justice ideas, but point out the flaws in them. So I hope that some schools, at least, will present this alongside some of the texts which are arguing for critical social justice ideas.
Okay, great. Kev, how about yourself? What are you hoping to get done at least in the next year?
I'm looking forward to working on all the content that we have planned. I think most of it's all been listed already. I also am planning a redesign of the website that should be, I mean, I didn't rush the website when we started, but I didn't exactly put as much love into it as I would have liked to. So I plan on doing a redesign of the website to make everything a lot better looking and a lot more accessible. And then mostly just working on content that everybody's already talked about.
Kevin, I'm afraid, tends to hide his light under a bushel, and I am one of the few people who has seen his writing, and he's going to be central to this book on critical thinking and liberal reasoning. I very much want ladies to introduce him to James Petts, because he and James Petts is like Kevin on steroids. So I think they would get together really well and try and actually, teach people how to reason again. So I'm quite excited about this book that I hope to write with Kevin, but which is going to mostly rely on his liberal ethical reasoning, which is very rigorous. We call him the head Vulcan for a reason.
Thanks.
And Jen, for yourself, what do you have going for the next year with Counterweight?
Well, I'm looking forward to contributing to the Counterweight handbook. I'm excited about that. And I just want to keep growing the community so that nobody who's experiencing this sort of incursion to their life from critical social justice has to go through it alone. I want the volunteers to be there for them, and I want the community to become close and to be able to be there for each other.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, I think that was great. If you guys have any last words, I'll let you go. If you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, get a hold of Counterweight, go ahead. I'll put the links down.
Yeah, brilliant. Please find us at counterweightsupport.com.
Okay, awesome. And if they want to get a hold of you, like for help or anything like that, it's from the same site, right?
Yeah, there's a contact form on the site, or it is info@counterweightsupport.com.
Awesome.
And if you're a budding content contributor and you'd like to write for us, visit the Write For Us section on the website and just drop us a message. We're always looking for new, exciting content.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so very much, and keep up the good work. It was good talking to you. And thanks everyone else for listening, and I'll be back.